Okay, so that was just a sort of short introduction to Marx. And now what we're going to do is look at the background to the Communist Manifesto. Now, Marx, of course, does not invent the idea of communism or socialism. In fact, as I said in the previous video, a lot of what Marx is known for is more as a philosopher, his theory of history, and also as a theorist and critic of capitalism. Even though the Communist Manifesto is probably his most well-known, and there's a reason we're reading it, Capital is really his magnum opus. And for those that really want to understand the way Marx understood and critiqued capitalism, is to read Capital Volume 1 at least. Although I would recommend always start with Section 8 of Capital, because he basically gives a history of capitalism, whereas the rest of it is incredibly abstract and very difficult if you struggle with it. That's why we don't actually have you read Capital for this class, because it's very difficult even for grad students. People who've been studying Capital their entire lives still struggle with everything in Capital. The other thing to do when you read it, if you read it, is ignore the math. It'll help you a lot. Okay. So, but he doesn't really invent the idea of communism. The idea of communism, or a kind of communal form of property, has existed for centuries, and it has existed in all different parts of the world. As we saw sort of previous lectures, indigenous peoples in North America especially, their definition of property was very different than the definition of Europeans at the time. They had a more collective understanding of property than Europeans did, as opposed to individualized private property. So in the case of the Communist League, which is formed in 1847 in London, it's meant to be an international kind of league and party to advocate for and critique sort of the capitalist mode of production that had emerged in Europe at the time. And again, Karl Marx, like Adam Smith and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, was reacting to the specifics of his time, right? When Smith was writing in 1776, he didn't really anticipate the egregious conditions that would emerge under the factory system in England and the United States and basically anywhere that this new form of industrial capitalism spread to. So Marx is in a very different time and place, right? He's looking at a lot of these problems with capitalism, not just in terms of the way people are treated, often violently under this system, but specifically the relationship and the relations capitalism creates within civil society. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are commissioned to draft a manifesto. Now, what you also have to understand about this particular context is the sort of political world and the political context that was going on. It wasn't just this emerging capitalism, but in 1848, there's a series of revolutions in Europe. In many ways, it's one of the most revolutionary years in history, even more so in some ways than 1789, which is, of course, the French Revolution, which we'll talk a lot more about after the midterm break in 2 weeks. So it was a democratic revolution. A lot of the revolutionaries in 1848 Europe were aiming to sweep away the remnants of feudalism in this political sphere. So a lot of the things that they wanted was universal male suffrage, right? This was long before people were advocating suffrage for women, although there were people advocating suffragette women in the 1840s. In fact, the sort of women's suffrage movement in the United States and England gets going around this specific time. They wanted restrictions on the church and restrictions to state power. They wanted the freedom of assembly and the press, and they also wanted national unity. Now, for a long time, I've been talking about, especially when we looked at the transition to feudalism and the last kind of lectures, specifically the role of the state in imperial expansion. We were looking at Spain, Portugal, England, and France. Now, those were kind of the key nation states that existed in Europe. But even as late as the mid-19th century, Germany and Italy did not exist as nation states. In fact, they were divided. If you looked at a map of Germany in the early 19th and mid-19th century, it was a patchwork of states. The largest state was Prussia, which was the largest and most powerful, then probably Bavaria. But when you look at a map, there's also dozens of smaller states, many of them city-states or very regional states, not quite as small as, say, the Italian city-states, but really a kind of fractured political scene. So you had this world that you could call Germany, but politically it was fragmented, right? You had different German states like Prussia, Bavaria, Austria, and smaller sort of city-states like Hamburg or Hanover, or smaller sort of regional states like Württemberg. these places. And Italy, you had a similar situation, right? The last time we looked at Italy, we were looking at the Renaissance, and we looked at the emergence of these sort of Italian city-states. Now, the way that Italy existed for most of its history after the fall of the Roman Empire was politically fractured. You had the middle of Italy, which would be Rome, which was mostly controlled by the Catholic Church, which is why to this day you still have Vatican City as a sovereign nation state, or not nation, but state within the country of Italy, or even more so specifically, the city of Rome. So a lot of these revolutionaries of 1848 were not just looking for these new rights and privileges, but also looking for national unity, specifically in Italy and Germany. They wanted an Italian nation state or a German nation state. And Italy basically gets this in the mid-19th century, and Germany becomes a unified country in 1871. Okay, so this is sort of the background. So a lot of what Marx is doing is providing a kind of manifesto for these revolutionaries. Even though a lot of the revolutions that were going on were sort of more liberal democratic, he represented a much more radical wing. And that's why he was asked to write the sort of manifesto of the Communist League that was formed in 1847. Okay, so let's stop this video here, and then I'll get into the main ideas of the Communist Manifesto.